Well, first of all, I want to just express my true heartfelt thanks and appreciation for being asked to speak to such an august audience of patriots. Certainly, all of you are patriots, as evidenced by your belonging to the sons and daughters of the American Revolution. I know we've already been through this, but are there any military veterans among you? If you would just stand up, and let's just once again thank these gentlemen and ladies for their kind service to our American nation. My topic for this important event today is titled Unity After Pearl Harbor. Would it be possible in today's America? I chose this topic because it seems to me as an objective observer that our great nation is currently more fragmented and there's less unity than possibly at any time in our history, literally since the Civil War. Many of you may find this to be an exaggeration, but at my age, I have never seen such a level of angst and partisanship in the United States, even to include the year of the Vietnam War, which I well remember. What I intend to do is take a brief look at how we stood together after Pearl Harbor, and then look at where we stand now. I'll discuss the inherent dangers of disunity, as well as the national strength that comes from unity, and propose some methods by which we might reach a state of greater internal harmony and accord in the United States. This topic is of extraordinary import, given the threats we face, and the need for leadership that could potentially successfully confront these threats and do so in a manner that brings our people together rather than splitting us apart. Let me first explain one thing. By unity, I do not mean uniformity of opinion, or that everyone in the country must be lockstep in agreement on every issue, which I think would be negative. And also, I think it is in direct contradistinction to our national heritage and the system envisioned and sworn into law by our founding fathers. By unity, I simply mean an environment in our country where Americans are driven forward together by a common desire to do what's best for the country as a whole, as opposed to being driven apart by fractious politicizing aimed at fulfilling a strategy of divide and conquer. A great man, President John F. Kennedy, once ask not what your country can do for you, but ask instead what you can do for your country. And so it must be if the United States is to continue to fulfill its responsibility as the most important beacon of freedom and opportunity in the world's history. I don't think there's too much question that World War II was the single greatest unifying event in our country's history, and that it was also the event that most defined America's identity and role in the second half of the 20th century. America is now and has always been reluctant to go to war. For many of the European monarchies that were prior to World War I known as the Great Powers, the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th was a time when they were in many ways looking for a reason to go to war. There were new technologies to be tried, new systems of government challenging the established hierarchy, and an adherence to a code of honor and chivalry among men-at-arms that seemed to be disappearing. Going to war brought with it the ability to address all of these issues, especially allowing for great chivalric, gentlemanly cavalry charges and the like. This was the position of much of Europe's leadership, despite dire warnings that the machine gun and long-range heavy artillery would make such tactics obsolete. We know, obviously, that the warnings went unheeded, and that the leadership of these nations rushed into war, which was a disaster in every respect. World War I also had the ancillary unintended consequences of spreading communism, and of course leading in the eventuality to World War II. All of this obviously is history. America was drawn to World War I reluctantly after much soul-searching and debate, and our involvement in World War II followed a similar path of reticence up until Pearl Harbor. Naval Marshal General Isoroku Yamamoto said after the unprecedented attack on Pearl Harbor, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame simply for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." Another more poetic version popularized by the film Tora 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 has the Admiral saying, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whichever quote is most accurate really isn't important. What is important is that this extremely intelligent Japanese naval officer knew that the attack was a mistake. He counseled against it, but was ordered to plan it, and he did do that as a good military man he was, at the cost of his own life. The following day, after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress and gave perhaps his most famous speech, referring to December 7th as a date that will live in infamy. The Senate voted unanimously for war. The House voted in favor of war with only one vote against. A few days after the Pearl Harbor attack, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, who responded by passing a joint congressional resolution for full participation of America's armed forces in World War II. Despite extraordinary setbacks and losses in the Pacific initially, the United States, whose carrier fleet had fortunately been away at the time of the attack, soon turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. Unity in support of the war effort never wavered, despite these setbacks and the long stream of bad news before American victories at Coral Sea and Midway reversed Japan's war fortunes. So how did average Americans respond? C.L. Sulzberger, in his book, The American Heritage Picture History of World War II, sums it up as follows. The Pearl Harbor attack, of course, was a massive wake-up call and a massive mobilization of the nation's manpower and industrial potential. In both these areas, the country was served well. Young men were drafted for combat duty, and women volunteered for non-combat support duties. Industries increased our labor force's work week. Even before December 7, 1941, the United States had been gearing up for war, and between July 1, 1940 and the end of July 1945, the United States produced an astonishing 296,601 aircraft, 71,060 ships, and 85,388 tanks. Women likewise stepped forward to work in defense plants doing industrial and heavy manual labor, work that had previously only done by men, ending forever the argument that a woman's place was in the home. As the nation geared up for war, another argument was settled. Isolationists could no longer argue that America must stay out of foreign entanglements in war. The only thing left to do was to defeat the perpetrators of the sneak attack that killed 2,000 Americans. As the bad news continued to flow from the Far East, American national energy and purpose strengthened. Red Cross volunteers, Irving Berlin patriotic songs, speeches, and intense efforts to mobilize America were all part of the intense need for Americans to prove that they could hit back at Japan. Out of this period of frustration grew the idea for an audacious bombing raid on Tokyo by Colonel James Doolittle. The Doolittle raid did little damage on Tokyo and had absolutely no effect on the eventual outcome of the war, but the psychological effect on the American public and on national morale was electric. The astonishing feat of launching B-25 medium bombers from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet 670 miles from Tokyo thrilled Americans who were hungry for any good news during the first year. America's response to Pearl Harbor and Somme was shock, followed by anger and resolve. American industrial might and a populace incensed and mobilized eventually led to the complete destruction of Japanese, German, and Italian fascism and launched the United States to its preeminent position as a superpower after World War II. So I think that's a fair illustration of the effect of unity, which forges national resolve and strengthens the country. But how can we get there in today's America, and perhaps more importantly, what have been the disastrous effects of disunity in our nation's past? Well, why don't we take a look at the latter question first. Obviously, we're all familiar with the Civil War, which began in 1861 and lasted until 1865, and left 600,000 Americans, both Union and Confederate, dead. Perhaps the best illustration of this is provided by an eyewitness account, which has come to be known as the battlefield tragedy of Malvern Hill, 1862. The Civil War could literally tear a family apart, pitting brother against brother or father against son, as each rallied to the flag of the cause that captured his heart. There's no more dramatic evidence of this than the encounter that took place on the battlefield of Malvern Hill, July 1st, 1862. Captain D.P. Conyngham was an officer in the Irish Brigade and described the incident shortly after the war. He said, "I had a Sergeant Driscoll, a brave man and one of the best shots in the brigade. When charging at Malvern Hill, a company of Confederates was posted in a clump of trees. He kept up a fierce fire on us and actually charged out in our advance. Their officer seemed to be a daring, reckless boy, and I said to Driscoll, if that officer is not taken down, many of us will fall before we pass that clump. Leave that to me, said Driscoll. So he raised his rifle, and the moment the officer exposed himself again, bang went Driscoll, over went the officer, and his company broke away at once. As we passed the place, I said, Driscoll, see if that officer is dead. He was a brave fellow. I stood looking on. Driscoll turned him over on his back. The officer opened his eyes for a moment and faintly murmured, Father, and closed them forever. I will forever recollect the frantic grief of Driscoll. It was harrowing to witness. The dead Confederate officer was his son who had gone south before the war. And what became of Driscoll afterwards? We were ordered to charge, and I left him there. As we were closing in on the enemy, he rushed up with his coat off, and clutching his musket, charged right up at the enemy, calling on his men to follow. He soon fell, but jumped up again. We knew he was wounded. On he dashed, but he soon rolled over like a top. When we came up, he was dead, riddled with bullets. After the Civil War, America was fractured and weak. It took decades to recover from this nightmarish event, for which, incidentally, many I'm sure don't realize this, the bills for this war were only relatively recently completely paid. During World War II, we saw ideologically based hatred and division taken to an unbelievable extreme in another country. At the Israel Museum dedicated to the Holocaust, known as Yad Vashem, there's a room where inventory photographs of the victims, mugshots essentially, taken by the Nazi perpetrators are continuously projected so as to give a face to the slain innocents. Endless of these are children, their bewildered innocent faces staring numbly at the camera. At the concentration camp Dachau, the officer's pistol range was located next to the crematorium, where the remains of the innocent victims of atrocity were burned in an attempt to hide genocide. Why were these two areas co-located? Because the Nazi officers used human beings for target practice. This, in what is probably history's most extreme example, is where disunity can lead. And I do want to make a personal point at this juncture, because I think it's wholly appropriate, that as a Jewish veteran of the Marines and the Navy, I feel it incumbent upon me to declare in the most earnest manner possible that there is not now, nor has there ever been, a more important guarantor of the safety, freedom, and continuity of the Jewish people in the United States of America and our mighty armed forces. For this I am personally indebted and am eternally grateful. The simple fact is the origin of my patriotism and undying loyalty to the United States. So what about after World War II? America was faced with the Cold War. After decades of fighting in Korea and Vietnam, El Salvador, Nicaragua, various hotspots around the globe, we emerged victorious. But where did this leave us? Initially basking in the glory of being the world's only remaining superpower, we soon became somewhat listless. After 9/11, also another singularly unifying event, albeit for a brief period, we soon lost all semblance of unity as endless self-recrimination and politicization of issues led us into a confused mire, kind of where we are right now. What are some of the sources of disunity in today's America? Well, for one, instead of celebrating and appreciating our differences, and to the same extent celebrating and appreciating the things we have in common, we are constantly torn apart as a people over race, religion, gender, ethnicity, politics, creed, belief, and almost anything else that can be exploited for political advantage. More and more, we're seeing political positions expressed almost in religious terms. And I can assure you that when political positions become like religion for a person, objectivity is lost and eventually it becomes impossible to achieve. It is objectivity that allows us to reach common ground, and it must not be lost if we are to regain unity in this country. I can also assure you that there is absolutely nothing wrong with being a Democrat, there is nothing wrong with being a Republican, there is nothing wrong with having liberal positions, and there is nothing wrong with having conservative positions, so long as you, your party leadership, and your elected officials don't put a political agenda before the safety, security, economic prosperity, and welfare of the country, which has to come first. What about cynicism? How often do we hear positions expressed from a cynical position as though the commentator or politician is the ultimate authority on some issue and that those in opposition are purveyors of nonsense? We hear that all the time in the news and the media by various politicians. It's easier still to fall back on, oh, you can't talk to that guy. Civil argument and discussion without anger or vitriol, however, is exactly what can bring us together, namely by sometimes finding common ground. And so that's the importance of interacting. Our political leaders are, it seems these days, less leaders than politicians, setting their own re-election as their number one priority and putting their own personal advancement before the needs of their constituents or their constitutional responsibilities. This is simply wrong and cannot continue if our country is to continue to function. I want you to remember this, that a leader finds a solution for every problem, while a demagogue finds a problem with every solution. We need leaders. We have more than enough demagogues. Does the internet help the situation? A recent study cited in the Smithsonian Magazine noted that reading internet news articles leads to anger, rage, and depression most commonly. Not terribly surprising, really, is it? We wonder why so many young people feel lost, enraged, and disenfranchised. Could it be because they are never shown anything positive or beautiful in their education, in the news media, or on the internet? There are so many extraordinarily beautiful things about our country and our history, so many wonderful monuments and natural spaces here and elsewhere. Why focus solely on the ugly? To me, it's very counterproductive. Finally, there is an unwillingness to take responsibility by any elected official, from our president on down. Harry Truman saying the buck stops here has been all but forgotten by those in public life. It often seems that those in power, when things go wrong, rather than putting forth their best effort to find an effective remedy, instead put all their energy into finding someone to blame for their own mistakes. This is the antithesis of leadership. I assure you that we can understand and appreciate our worthy opponents' positions, and while we may not agree, we can disagree in a manner that is civil and respectful. We can talk about our strengths without talking about the other guy's weakness. We can have a plan that doesn't revolve around what's wrong with their plan. As I've said, a leader finds a solution for every problem, while a demagogue finds a problem with every solution. How many times have you heard our plan is better than their plan because it isn't their plan? This kind of thinking has really led to our current morass. So how can we as a nation overcome these disturbing negative trends and find a path to national unity? The answer is simple. It is leadership. Leadership is a concept that is fairly simple to define and understand. It's thrown about very often, but most people really don't have an idea of what it actually means. So what is leadership? Leadership is really nothing more than the ability to influence a person or group of people to accomplish an assigned task or mission, or to achieve a predetermined goal. That's it. And it sounds simple, and it is simple. But though it is easy to define and easy to understand, it can be very difficult to put into practice and practice effectively. The Marine Corps points out that there are 14 leadership traits: bearing, courage, decisiveness, dependability, endurance, enthusiasm, initiative, integrity, justice, judgment, knowledge, loyalty, tact, unselfishness. In addition to those traits, I always add 3 more. For a leader to be truly effective, must be practiced. These include kindness, compassion, and basic human decency. I ask all of you to consider how many of these traits, especially the most important trait, integrity, that our political leaders appear to practice frequently, if at all, which is, in and of itself, a shame. Imagine how much more credibility our leaders in every branch of government would have if they simply demonstrated these leadership traits. How much better off would the country be? How much more of a feeling of a common destiny would we have? How much lower might our $18 trillion debt be? Well, we've all heard of JCPenney. Everybody's remembers JCPenney. When I was a kid, that's where my mom shopped for going back to school and for my holiday gifts and whatnot. I was recently in one of their stores and was disturbed to see how far this once giant retailer had actually fallen off. As I walked back toward the customer service area, I noted posted in the very back of the store, as far from any possible customer or employee traffic, a set of rules for business penned by old JCPenney himself in 1913. And he had in the past set these before his employees as a means of communicating the best possible set of practices to make his retail business fair and successful. Here they are. The JCPenney idea, adopted in 1913. To serve the public as nearly as we can to its complete satisfaction. To expect for the service we render a fair remuneration and not all the profit that the traffic will bear. To do all in our power to pack the customer's dollar full of value, quality, and satisfaction. To continue to train ourselves and our associates so that the service we give will be more and more intelligently performed. To improve constantly the human factor in our business. To reward the men and women in our organization through participation in what the business produces. And to test our every policy, method, and act in this wise: does it square with what is right and just? I was so impressed with these simple, honest rules for ethical business practice that I photographed them, took them home, and reread them. It occurred to me that with some simple modifications, these rules could apply to the federal government and even to the way young people interact with their school and community. So here is the adaptation of the JCPenney idea for the federal government. To serve the American citizenry as nearly as we can to its complete satisfaction. To expect nothing but fair pay and benefits in return for the service we render. We are not in the business of making profit at the taxpayer's expense. To do all in our power to pack our citizens' tax dollar full of value, quality, and satisfaction. To continue to train ourselves and every member of the federal government so that the service we provide will be more and more efficiently and intelligently performed. To constantly improve the human factor in governance and when dealing with American citizens who are the reason the federal government exists. To reward our citizens and the men and women of the federal government through participation in the processes and opportunities that made our country great. And to test every policy, method, and act in this manner. Is it just, fair, and right? Another adaptation of these as guiding principles for young people. To serve my family, faith, community, and country to the best of my ability so that my actions support the ideals inherent in each of these. To expect nothing in return for my loyalty and service except the respect and admiration of those who I serve and support with my actions. To do everything in my power to ensure that the service I provide is equal to or greater in value than what I receive. To continue to seek education and self-improvement so that I'm able to be the best possible leader and citizen. To constantly improve my interaction with peers, teachers, family members, parents, and religious leaders, without whom I would be unable to function, grow, and achieve. To reward those who provide guidance, sustenance, shelter, and education in my life with my respect, honesty, and obedience. And to think before I speak and act, and to consider every course of action carefully in this manner, is it fair, just, honest, and right? Imagine if our federal government followed these principles in devising policy or executing their responsibilities. How much more efficient and effective would they be? Again, how much less than $18 trillion might our national debt be? Now imagine a president whose only focus was on protecting our great nation and raising the standard of living for all Americans, who didn't focus solely on politics and re-election, whose primary concern wasn't fundraising or ensuring partisan power, who had no pretensions of taking the most brilliantly conceived and devised system of government the world has ever known and converting it into some half-baked behemoth born of ill-advised theoretical conceptualizations that have not worked, do not work, and will never work. A president who understood and held sacred his or her responsibility to the American people would be able to sincerely and with integrity make the following promises and vows and express the vision that I will lay out. A promise to always engage in free and open trade with other nations, to never interfere in the internal affairs of other nations, to always act in America's interests while always attempting to guarantee the mutual security of the United States and other nations, to always seek peaceful resolution to conflict, to never underestimate an adversary, and to never abandon Americans in the face of danger. A vow to make our nation the most prosperous, safest nation on earth, to make our children and young adults the best, highest achieving students on earth, to never spy on Americans, to promote our market economy so that innovation, advancement, and success are accessible to all Americans, to make government work for Americans, to make government less intrusive, to reduce the size of government, to make our military the best equipped, best trained, and most ready force on earth, to never ever put politics or my own best interests in front of the best interests of our nation. A vision of an America that is, again, a beacon of hope for people all over the world. An America that is the world's innovation think tank. An America that defines progress, creativity, health, and a clean environment. An America that leads the world in research, science, and development. American cities rising to new heights of vibrancy, livability, and sustainability. American family farms and ranches that wholesomely feed our country and maintain the best rural traditions of our nation. And finally, an America that our citizens and our founding fathers could be proud of. All of this stems from really the one most important leadership trait I've outlined, integrity. With integrity as the inviolable rule of governance, among the three branches of government, everything I've said could easily be put into practice. Rather than constantly naysaying and emphasizing the negative and how the other guys just don't get it, how our plan is better because it isn't their plan, our leaders must focus on the promise of a brighter future for all Americans. They must step out of the way and let American inventiveness and ingenuity be the beacon that lights the way for a new spirit of innovation and achievement for every American, most especially for our young